Hola, muy buenos días.
Hi, good morning to everyone. And we want to welcome each and all of you to this third session of our ongoing seminar on democracy and elections in the world. Today, we have the pleasure in this third session of having an opportunity to deal with a relevant subject that we will work on, something that we have witnessed recently. But before that, we want to listen to the different organizations and institutions as well as those that represent the institutions participating in this permanent seminar, which has been very fruitful in its last two sessions. It has given us a lot of information to understand today's reality. I won't take more of your time. At INE, we want to welcome each and all of you. We want to welcome the audience as well as the people following us on social media. And now let me introduce the Dean of the Law School of the National University, Raul Contreras Bustamante, so he can share a few words. Thank you, Mrs. Zabala. Thank you. Good morning to everyone. Good morning to all of you watching us live on YouTube, on the social media channels of the National University, the Law School, and the INE. It's a real pleasure for both institutions or organizations to be participating in this third session of the symposium we have organized under the title Democracy and Elections in the World to finally analyze these partial balance to understand how the electoral process worked in the US, our neighboring country. I mean, the political system and the idea of democracy succeeded in the US. They achieved the victory. I believe that beginning on January 20, the world is living in peace, more in peace, because there were negative forecasts, but the system came ahead, and the oldest democracy in the world was able to move forward. However, we had access to some images about the siege of a capital, and that led the US people to a moment of reflection, and they shocked the world because it was not easy to see what happened or what was happening in the capital. Because it looked like a science fiction movie. And then we saw the pictures of soldiers sleeping in hallways of the Capitol. And we also saw the city of Washington turned into a city under siege to be able to ensure that the inauguration went well. I believe that this is an important element that we should analyze in this symposium. And the academia worldwide will produce tons of paper as to what should be happening in the US from now on. Now, this taking over by Joe Biden's government, the characteristics of his personality and the initial measures he took have been welcomed in Mexico and the world, because once again they're announcing that the US will make an attempt to go back to its role as a leader of international communities. And of course, that will involve a change in policy to regain that liberal democratic sense that the world is expecting from the most powerful nation in the world. Biden is taking over with a polarized nation. And of course, he will have to tread carefully to be able to change the electoral system over time. An electoral system that is obsolete, that has a lot of flaws, and that is no longer useful to democracy in the country. The country that created the first constitution that went back to the first federal republic, and that has been an example in many areas. I want to congratulate the organizers, especially Dr. Mari Carmen Annalise, for making this invitation for us to participate here. We're more than willing to listen and to learn what a lot from your analysis, and also from the analysis of the results of this seminar. Thank you, Dr. Raul, the Dean of the Law School of the National University. And next, we have the President Counselor of the National Electoral Institute, Lorenzo Cordova Vianello. Go ahead, Dr. Vianello. Thank you, Claudia. First of all, I would like to say hi to everyone, and I would like to thank each and all of you for your availability and your willingness to be here in this third session, the final session of this seminar that we have organized together with the Law School of the National University. The Law School and the INE have organized this symposium. By the way, they are the best school of law in the country. So I want to welcome each and all of you, and once again, thank you. I would like to say hi, especially to our guests to this session, because here we will conduct an assessment of what we have seen in the last few months in the world and in the US from a standpoint of their elections. And this week, the final transition period regarding political power in the country. So I want to thank Dr. Ana Maria Salazar because she's an expert in international affairs, and she's also an expert especially in home security issues. Amy Glover, who is knowledgeable about the relationships between the US and Mexico. She's the director of Agile. And I want to welcome and thank Dr. Jose Luis Valdez Ugalde, professor and researcher from the CSUN Center of National University. And of course, I want to thank Sebastian Brack, who is the director of the program of Elections and Democracy of the Kofi Annan Foundation, an organization that has been a close partner, a long-time partner of INE to promote an agenda to build a democracy in Mexico and Latin America. Thanks to all of you for your time and your participation. And of course, we want to thank the organizers, including Mari Carmen Annalise and Fernando Gesto. Thank you for your commitment to this interinstitutional project. This permanent seminar is a space that we made the decision to organize, to listen to different voices and perspectives of democracy in general and of electoral processes in particular in these current times. The relevance of the electoral process in the US has led us to pay more attention to that nation in this first stage of a seminar, but in future sessions we will address lessons and reflections on democratic life in Latin American countries as well as country in other regions of the world. The reason for this platform has to do with several reasons. There have been several processes that have challenged electoral processes and hatred speech that have affected elections. That demands our attention, especially if we consider that the COVID-19 pandemic and the conditions of exceptionality in some countries to deal with it have worsened the situation in many countries. The aim of this seminar is to promote a better understanding of the dynamics, rules, and institutions that make a democracy and elections the best mechanisms, as imperfect as it may be. But that's the best we have to renew public powers in a peaceful manner, to identify our own conflicts, especially in complex societies like the ones we have today, in addition to creating favorable conditions for development for nations in Mexico and the world. I believe that one of the comments we can make regarding the electoral political process in the US is that democracy, as already explained by Joe Biden in his inauguration few days ago, is fragile and resilient at the same time. But I believe that democracy requires a renovation. We need to rethink its principles, values, and rules with having in mind the benefits or the well-being of the population. It is urgent to rethink democracy, elections, and citizenship, and that has to do with two events that are in appearance contradictory, but are part of the same reality. In October, more than 160 million people voted in US elections, the highest ever. The electoral participation or turnout was really, really high. We'll have to go back to 120 years ago to find participation rates or turnout rates as high. Despite that high turnover, and despite that citizens' commitment to renew political power, 2 months later, on January 6th, the world witnessed an unheard of event in one of the oldest democracy in the world, as already explained by Dr. Contreras, the siege or the assault on the Capitol. This event, which is the result of previous dynamics and practices, showed how this divide and intolerance fueled by an unethical use of social media and intolerance represent a threat for the rethinking of democracy. But especially it shows that all of us should work so that this phenomenon won't affect our democratic life. These two events illustrate both the challenges and the possibilities of democracy today, and elections as an essential part of that. And I believe that thinking about citizens and the quality of values and principles that citizens should look up to and follow in a democratic society is essential. The reconstruction of democracy has always been a collective work. We need to defend it, we need to sustain it, we need to rethink it, but also recreate it. But that is also a responsibility of all. And we're living times where democratic irresponsibility should not only be called out and identified, but also fought. Thanks once again to each and all of you for sharing your thoughts in this space with all of us. Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Lorenzo Cordova, President Counselor of the INE. Thank you for your message. We will now formally start our session, our third session. And it focuses on an analysis and a process to share thoughts about the process in the US, talking about democracy, institutions, and elections, an overview. And to that end, as we have already mentioned, we will have great personalities that will participate in this reflection process. I will actually introduce the different speakers who will be sharing their thoughts. To introduce them, I will read a short bio of our speakers, not to take too much of your time. And if you want, then I may elaborate not only on their background, but also on other ideas. We have with us today Ana Maria Salazar. She is an expert in international law and national security, especially in connection with Latin American countries, and she is a collaborator of El Universal, a Mexican newspaper, among others. In addition to hosting Living in News and Living in Mexico, a national radio program, she studied law in the University of California at Berkeley. She's the author of the books The War That Comes and National Security Today, The Challenge of Democracy. She has held different positions in the U.S. government, including the position of the Assistant Secretary for the Defense and Support of the fight against drugs. She was working in the embassy in Colombia, and she was an advisor to Bill Clinton's envoy for the Americas. She was recognized by the magazine Hispanic Business Magazines as one of the 100 most influential Hispanic Americans in the U.S. Dr. Salazar, we want to welcome you. And then we have Sebastian Brach. He works for the Kofi Annan Foundation. He has been there since 2012, and currently he's the director of the program for elections and democracy. He is in charge of work having to do with elections in particular and transitions in general. He was also the chief political advisor for Kofi Annan. Previously, he was a delegate of the International Red Cross Committee in different missions in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, including countries in conflict. He's a graduate from Oxford University and Vienna Academy. He's a French citizen and a Swiss citizen. He has lived in different countries of Europe, Southeast Asia, Maghreb, and the Caribbean. Welcome, Sebastian Brag. Welcome to this third session. And I also have the pleasure of introducing Amy Glover. She's an expert in the bilateral relation between Mexico and the US, and she has a very broad knowledge of Latin America. She has a bachelor's degree in political science from the Georgetown University and a master's degree in economy and Latin American studies of the International Advanced Studies School of the Johns Hopkins University. She has held several positions as an advisor for multinational companies. And she is very knowledgeable about the health sector and also the sectors of technology, health, and environment, among others. She's currently the president and founder of Agile E, which is a public affairs and communications, a strategic communications firm based in Mexico City. She's from the US by birth, and she's Mexican by choice. Welcome, Amy Glover, for being here in this third session. Also, I have the pleasure of introducing Jose Luis Valdez Ugalde. Mr. Ugalde is a full-time researcher of the Center on Research for North America of the National Autonomous University of Mexico. He has been in that position since 1994. He actually was the director of that center between 2001 and 2011. He's part of a national researchers system. He's a regular member of the National Academy of Sciences. He has a bachelor's degree in political science from the Metropolitan Autonomous University, and he has a master's degree in political sociology, and he has a PhD in international affairs or international relations from the London School of Economy and Political Science. He's a professor in several universities in Mexico, the US, Germany, and the UK. He is part of more than 10 editorial committees. He's author, co-author, publisher, and coordinator of different books and articles. His most recent book is the one entitled Unheard of US, Power and Decadence in the Times of Trump. He is a collaborator of CNN on the radio program, and he's an opinion columnist for the Excelsior newspaper. Welcome, Dr. Jose Luis Valdez, to this third session. As you can see, all the different guests are great. I don't want to take much of your tight agenda. And so first, let's talk to Ana Maria Salazar. And we'll talk about the electoral model and the electoral system as well as its operation in the US, given this challenge and this attack that affected the system, but were not enough to destroy it. We already talked about the threats implicit in a democracy. Why was the system, the electoral system in the US resilient enough? Well, the US system is decentralized. It is different from the one in Mexico. And in that system, there are different ways of exercising political rights through voting. And I believe that the system could stand this attack or these impacts because they have solid institutions that showed clearly that this system is based on the recreation of democracy with responsibility, prudence, and the firm action of the different institutions involved. What could happen with this democratic model or this consolidated democratic regime that we have today before us? Well, that's part of the topics to discuss today. And we should talk about the solidity of its institutions and the current threats. And for that, we need to consider how polarized the country will be after the recent elections, and to what extent this divide can affect democracy, because there has been an effort to divide as opposed to finding coincidences. In this case, the riot was promoted by the exiting president. Could that be a threat for the U.S. Democracy? Well, institutions showed or proved solid, but to what extent will it have an impact on the U.S., other countries, and especially in the democratic system in Mexico? We have a lot of food for thought, but for that, we have our experts. Ana Maria, well, you can speak for 15 minutes approximately to share your reflections, your thoughts. Thank you for organizing this forum in this moment in particular.
We are all trying to understand exactly what's been happening. What is it that led to our seeing those pictures of an uprising, some of whom call it a coup d'etat, others feel that it was a violent form of protest. But it's important for us to understand what happened with that attack on the Capitol a few weeks back. But above all, we should also remember that although we were all very surprised, those of us who work in the field of national security perhaps weren't quite that surprised about what was happening. Before I begin to make my comments, I just wanted to add something, because otherwise the dean of the law school will be making a comment. I have a PhD. I have a bachelor's degree. I have a master's degree. I'm therefore not a PhD. I just wanted to clarify that before anybody brings that up. And also, in order to avoid being told anything from my editorial company about the fact that I haven't clarified that I also work with El Financiero, a newspaper. For the past 3 years, I've been talking about US-related issues with them. And so I just wanted to clarify that from my bio as well, okay? In any case, I just wanted to thank you all for inviting me to participate at this event. I would like to tell Dr. Lorenzo Cordova that he probably recalls that on many occasions we've met at different forums or in different medias, and we've always, when I've posed my questions, I would always be somewhat concerned because everything related to election processes had to do with a lot of security issues as well, which are things that are very difficult to talk about publicly, but which are also points that one way or another define the stability and the governance of a country. The issue of security, and Lorenzo and I have always had this type of conversation, and I've always appreciated that opportunity to do so. And we realized that this is something that is very difficult to talk about publicly. But the INE, I understand, has always been prepared for all types of contingencies that might arise. I believe that if we look at what happened in the US, there are several lessons that we can learn and I think it would be useful not just for the election process that will be taking place in Mexico later this year, but also for election processes that will be held throughout the world. Claudia, you referred to the strength of US institutions, their soundness, and I think you're right. But in these elections, in these US elections, in addition to the juridical and historical soundness of these institutions, there was also the fact of the individuals that are part of all of these institutions that are part of the national security system. I think that this is something that has been mentioned in the past, but the mere fact, and I think that this is something that affects the election process is how institutions are sometimes very vulnerable, because the joint command of the armed forces in the U.S. had to publish a letter with the most important uniformed officers, in which, in late November, no, I think it was December, in which they said that what they would be defending was the Constitution. And they were calling upon the fact that they wanted to make sure that all the armed forces should be aware that they were obliged to defend the Constitution and the constitutionality of the election processes. And they were also aware of the fact that the next U.S. president would be Joe Biden. In that letter, they also called upon President Trump indirectly to be aware of that. And I think that that is something that is very important, because the 10 ministers of defense or secretaries of defense of the past 20 years also published a letter in which they were calling upon the armed forces to remind them that they were required to defend the Constitution and constitutionality. And they were also calling upon Donald Trump, who was the president at the time, that he should not use the armed forces improperly. And I think those two were key for us to understand the risk that was being run in the U.S. because, and let me just add something else. 2 weeks after the elections, President Donald Trump fired his defense secretary. And I bring all of this up because it leads us to understand the risks that are being run. And we have some statistics that still haven't been confirmed, but there's a lot of very interesting testimonies to that effect, especially if an impeachment trial will be held, because that's something that's still somewhat up in the air. But I'm sure that there will be a lot of investigations taking place, a lot of interviews, and a lot of questions being posed about this whole issue, about the possibility that the U.S. president wanted to use the armed forces to ensure that he would stay in power. I've resorted to my old textbooks from back in the day in which I was in law school, because I saw that there were certain articles in the Constitution that I didn't understand, that I should have reread to understand what was actually happening in the world. But even if you read everything, and even if you try to imagine the world of Darth Vader or the dark side of the moon, it would have been hard for us to envision the possibility of a president staying in power under certain conditions. And that attack on the Capitol, the attack on Capitol Hill, was something that I felt was very similar to a coup d'etat. But in order for us to be able to understand the risk the U.S. was running at that point in time, right then and there at the Capitol Hill, Vice President Pence was there, as well as Senator McConnell, who is the representative of the majority in the Senate, as well as Nancy Pelosi, who represents the House of Representatives. And so those three people are key to the U.S. government. And if they had not been able to stop the violence at the time, they would be basically eliminating the three people who were next in line for succession. Can you just imagine what type of an impact that would have had on U.S. democracy? They would have dealt a terrible blow on the government. And so when you look at the attack that took place on Capitol Hill, What was of greatest concern is the fact that those who were supposed to protect that historical moment in time, which was more of a issue of protocol when the winner was going to be declared, in spite of all of the information that they had, all of the indications they had, they didn't have enough forces available. And there we would ask why they hadn't requested the National Guard to come in. And then when everything was actually taking place, I'm not going to get into the details, but we saw that the National Guard didn't come in, and there's some information that there were certain governors who wanted to help with that effort by sending their National Guard. Nobody was answering the private phone. And so the election process for any democracy is always a point of extreme weakness, because national security institutions have to be not just open, but also very clear as to the role they play in election processes, and to understand not just the institutions, but also constitutionality. And when I refer to national security apparatus, I'm talking about the armed forces, intelligence, police forces, and so on. All of the infrastructure that a state has to make sure that elections are taking place within a country with rule of law, and in which the rules of the game are clearly stipulated. And so there was so much concern on the part of the structures and institutions that people who represented those institutions from the highest level had to come before the public and say, we are going to defend our constitutionality. And if President Donald Trump declares a state of emergency, which is what some people think he was planning on doing, that it couldn't be backed, that they wouldn't be able to back it. And so once you understand that context, you realize the risk that was being run in the US was real, and that perhaps the armed forces would be pulled out, and therefore Mr. Trump might remain in the presidency because the institutions didn't have everything in place, although the Constitution stipulated that they should be available, but they didn't have the capability of doing it at that point in time. I know that my colleagues will be talking about what happened during the elections as well, but I think it's important for us to remember that we have to be clear about the rules of the game. First of all, we have to understand the weakness of the state when we're talking about elections in terms of foreign involvement, for example, which happened in the US in the past. Also, the possibility of armed groups that want to change the results or influence the results of the election processes, as well as what all of this would represent of what might happen if there was a natural disaster, because that can also happen as well, precisely during the elections. And so we have to be prepared for all types of contingencies, and the security apparatus has to play an important role providing information, making sure that they determine whether they have to protect the institutions, candidates, make sure that there are no additional threats. And so within that context, it's key for us to be very clear as to what the rules of the game are for the national security and public security apparatus. I think it's also very important for us to have this type of discussion, especially when we're talking about the fact that the armed forces have been playing an increasingly important role. For example, they're the ones that transport the ballots and so on, making sure that elections can be held peacefully in certain countries and so on. And so we have to just be very clear as to what role everybody will be playing in these types of election processes, and perhaps call upon Mexico, for example, to make sure that everything is done very transparently, because they're going to play a key role now more than ever. For example, the army, which will be replacing what was previously done by the civil police. In Mexico, we're talking about the federal police. And so I know I only have a minute left in order to be able to conclude my part of the conversation, but I wanted to say that when we speak about the strength of the institutions that defended the governance of the U.S. and U.S. democracy, I would insist that institutions are comprised of humans, people. And in the case of the U.S., I think we have to acknowledge the national security apparatus and the public security apparatus because of everything that they did, because it is their responsibility to defend institutions, but particularly that vision in which they have to defend the Constitution and not a specific individual. And with that, I would like to conclude my remarks. Thank you very much, Ana Maria. That was very interesting. The state depends on election processes, and I agree with you in terms of that premise. And I think that this is the way in which we can make sure that people can freely exercise their rights, but particularly remember that all of this social compact that we've signed, which is the Constitution, the rules of the Constitution, and we all owe ourselves to the Constitution. And so what you just said, Ana Maria, is extremely relevant because of the implications that national security poses in all elections all over the world. And today, or rather more recently, we've seen how it was handled in the U.S. Thank you very much, Ana Maria. Now let's move on with the comment of Sebastian Brack. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. So given the starting point of my predecessor, I have to come out clean and say that I have neither a PhD nor am I an expert per se on American politics. Most of my work has been handling delicate electoral transitions in countries in Africa and Southeast Asia. But surprisingly enough, that experience has proved remarkably interesting and insightful for what's gone on in the States, because we've seen many phenomena and many characteristics which we're accustomed to seeing in more, let's say, fledgling democracies. In particular, the calling into question of the integrity of an electoral process, the nervous glances at what the military might do as a next step. These are not things we're used to seeing in well-established democracies like America. And so I think that's perhaps what I can bring to the conversation, is maybe look at what these elections and what the events of the last 4 years in America say, and about the global democratic picture, and how they might influence events abroad. So I look forward to the discussion. Since I'm asked to give a little presentation, I'd like to just pick up on the title of this conversation, then look at the populist threat to balanced democracy across the world and the drivers of this rise of populism. I'd like to also look at some of the key changes in America that made Trump's victory possible, and finally perhaps volunteer a few ideas of solutions. So I really like the fact that in the title of the conversation, you focused on the word balance, because I think that's very much at the heart of most democratic systems, but especially America's democratic system, because the founding fathers, as we know, were afraid of basically a majoritarian democracy. They were afraid of mob rule. And so they set up a constitution that provided checks and balances to check the risk of mob rule, but also check the risk of a dictatorship. They had all come from, their reference point, of course, was British monarchy, and they wanted to avoid the risk of another king and a threat to democracy that way. So the system they set up actually was designed to prevent the capture of the state by a dictator, but also the risk of mob rule. And so democracy as it stands in America is a delicate balance, of course, between the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary, but also between the centralized state and the federal states, between the majority and minorities, between effective executive action and civil liberties. So in fact, this concept of balance, which you put in the title, I think captures very much the spirit of a modern representative democracy. And this is exactly what I think the populists threaten. Because the populists, in the name of democracy, say that in fact these checks and balances on executive power power should be wiped away for them so that they can better exercise the will of the people as defined by majoritarian electoral politics. And so that's why I think they represent a threat. And I think populism across the world, it exists all over the world and not just in America. And I think it's less a question of the content or ideology of the party rather than the style, because there are left-wing populists, there are right-wing populists, and there are populists who you can't really define in a left-right dichotomy. What they have in common is this idea that they question and they try to weaken the institutions and the balances in a democracy and strengthen their own executive power at all costs, and claim to be the only legitimate representatives of the people, and therefore delegitimize their opponents, but also these institutions and checks on their power. And Trump very much played this playbook in the States. He delegitimized, the FBI, the courts, the media throughout his reign. So in fact, it was very worrying that way. So I think that it's important to highlight that at this stage in history, not just American history, world history, the main threat to democracy comes no longer from coup d'etat or from revolutions as they did in the past, but actually from democratically elected governments who then subvert the very democratic rules that allowed them to reach power in the first place. And of course, we know this has happened in many countries, and Putin in Russia, Erdogan in Turkey, I think Duterte to some extent to the Philippines. This is actually a global phenomenon. It's not specifically an American phenomenon, but therefore it's very important. Elections become all the more important that we know that actually nowadays the biggest threat to democracy comes from democratically elected leaders themselves. So that's very important to bear in mind. And as my predecessor was saying, actually in this case, the military was actually a sort of bulwark, which is ironic because in history and in most of the world, the military is usually seen as a threat to democracy, not a bulwark. Anyway, so the question is, what has allowed these populists to come to power? And I think it's very important because we could look at the technicalities, we can look at what happened on the 6th. Well, why are populists who subvert, question, and challenge the very norms of democracy upon which many of our systems rest, why are they seen as popular? And I've been thinking about this and reading quite a bit about this, and I think there are three factors that really come to mind. The first, I think, is the breakdown of traditional structures that traditionally channeled and moderated political life. So the membership, party membership, newspaper subscriptions, union membership, church attendance, all these institutions played a moderating influence on politics. They channeled political dissatisfaction and opinions in a constructive and institutional way. But these institutions have been very, very much weakened in the last few decades. A second factor I think we have to bear in mind is a backlash against globalization. Although globalization has by and large increased wealth around the world and risen hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, it also has created a lot of winners and losers. And I think that around the world, we see now backlash against globalization by a large share of the population that has seen wage stagnation, the rise of inequality, and a certain very small minority becoming phenomenally wealthy while their own conditions don't improve. Also linked to globalization, I think we have to also look at the mass increase in illegal immigration, which is also linked to globalization and its many flows. And this has threatened a sense of cultural identity in many countries, which had a basis of national identity based on traditional ethnic composition or religious composition, which is being challenged. And finally, I think a third factor which leads to this rise of populism is a dissatisfaction with the functioning of many of our democracies. I think that many voters see that national governments are less able to effect change in a globalized world. They feel that their states have been captured by special interests. They see a certain degree of legislative gridlock that prevents state from actually delivering on electoral promises. So I think these three basket of issues lead to, I think, to create the right scene for the rise of populists who promise to change all this and to attack these problems in a very simplistic and simple way, which of course I think they can't deliver on, but that's the promise I think that attracts people. I think that Trump's rise in America is linked to a few more specific conditions that arose in America in particular. I think among those, I would look at the rise of the primary system of choosing electoral candidates by parties that came up in the 70s. It removed the filter that party leaderships had traditionally played in selecting candidates and allowed demagogues to appeal directly to a much bigger audience. And we know in the American case, Trump, I think, effectively did a hostile takeover of the Republican Party, even though he wasn't very popular with the party leadership. And I remember in the run-up to the election, many of my Republican friends in America saying, don't worry, he'll be eliminated at some point. But in fact, he was actually voted in a very open primary system. And the primary system reduced the capacity of traditional party structures to select and filter the kind of people who could reach high office. A second factor, I think, that played a role in the States was the end of the fairness doctrine in the 80s. There'd been a rule in America, I think, in telecommunications that media had to reflect different points of view and had to be more balanced, provide balanced reporting. And that fairness doctrine, as it was called, was abolished in the 80s and allowed the proliferation of polarized and very ideologically marked media. And I think that was also a key long-term factor that allowed for these things to occur. Linked to that, of course, was that then, therefore, the proliferation of polarized media. And even before the internet, you had famously, talk shows, radical talk shows and whatnot that created this very strong echo chamber and these very polarized and divisive let's say, sub-worlds instead of the traditional common, massive national broadcasters, which would have created a certain sense of common identification of issues. And finally, crowdfunding and the potential of crowdfunding by the social media, because it allowed demagogues like Trump or others to actually bypass traditional donors and traditional establishment figures which traditionally had funded the political system and go directly to the masses of the people, and therefore, again, weaken the filter on the rise of demagogues in American politics. So now some proposed solutions in the last few minutes. I think that we have to recognize this is a unique opportunity to try and fix some of the issues in America. And not only because the new Biden administration has control of the Senate, the House of Representatives, and the White House, so that gives them a unique room for maneuver, but also hopefully because the Republican Party has seen after the 6th of January, the final straw of what could happen if they continue going down this populist road. And hopefully this will be a chance to kind of restore a more centrist normality. I know that in the initial aftermath of the 6th of January, there were a lot of polls showing that many Republicans supported what happened. But I think those now new polls show that actually a majority of Republicans disapprove of that storming of the Capitol. And I think hopefully it's a wake-up call, and a number of high-level Republicans did react late, but they did react, like, of course, Mitch McConnell, like like Pence, and like Mrs. Cheney. So I think there's a chance now, an opportunity for a real reform of America's divisive and polarized politics to regain some kind of normal center ground. So what I think is necessary here, I think is, I'd say, three different aspects. The first is restoring trust in government. The second would be making globalization work for all. And finally, restoring a certain degree of regulation of social media, because I think that the cancellation of Trump's accounts really, again, brought to the fore an issue which has been building up for a while about the right role for these social media companies, the power they can have and they can't have, and there needs to be some kind of public legislation or regulation of what their role is and sets limits on those. So in terms of restoring trust in government, I think a lot will depend on how Biden governs. Hopefully he'll be able to govern in a bipartisan way. Now, it also, I think, it is a chance to pass what they call the For the People Act of 2019, which includes things like expanding early voting, a redistricting reform, campaign finance reform, automatic voter registration, and higher regulation and transparency of funding. Another, I think, key move to restore trust in government is to invest more in civic education and again, reform campaign finance. And on the globalization front, making globalization work for all, I think it's something which also helped populists is a sense of injustice that the winners of globalization largely can escape or at least reduce taxation considerably, while the middle class pays a lot of tax. And in a sense, I think that this question of the tax evasion has to be addressed. I think also there will be a stronger control, I think, of trade. I think that's not going to go away, because I think there's a sense that America has to make sure that the working class benefits from globalization, and there's going to be a big debate about how that's going to be done. But I think that's another issue. I think that people have to sense that an open global economy has to benefit the majority, and that's going to be very difficult, but I think it's a necessary condition. And finally, I talked about arriving at some kind of regulation of democratic regulation of social media, and defining a better definition of their role. So I think that we're at a crossroads here, not just for American democracy, but for democracy all over the world, because of the importance of America in global affairs. And having worked on a number of elections and democratic systems around the world, I've really felt very keenly the departure of America from this space over the last 4 years. I think it's emboldened and empowered a lot of would-be authoritarians. And I think that a lot of countries, a lot of movements, democratic movements, are hoping that America will become more involved. So I think that the key issue for this, even globally, is for America to restore trust in its democracy locally, domestically, because I think that nothing is more powerful, as Biden says, as a power of example. And I think that's where America will have to show its leadership. And I think that although some people say that the events of the last 4 years have debased the currency of American democracy, I think on the contrary, it helps to, I think America can then have a more humble position and say, listen, we've learned, we know exactly the fragility of democracy. Look, we came very close to losing certain democratic rights in America, and therefore we want to work together and build a common, global front for the defense of democracy, not from a position of superiority, but from a position of a shared concern for our common democracy and freedoms. And I think America has a key role to play there. And I think one other factor, final factor, which I think will play a role in helping this come about in an optimistic point of view, is the return of geopolitical competition. I think after the Cold War, there was a sense of complacency amongst democracies that we were the only game in town. And I think that also fed into maybe more irresponsible behavior amongst politicians in the States. I think now there's a keen sense there is a return of geopolitical competition and rivalry. And therefore, the stakes have never been higher for America to get its act together. And hopefully this will help to also forge bipartisan consensus on the Hill, and will also help them agree to a common program of democracy, defense, and promotion around the world, because the stakes are very high. And we're back into a situation where there is a competition of models. And I think that we all want to defend a more democratic and freer future for all. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Sebastian Brack.
Thanks a lot, Sebastian Brack. Thank you for sharing these thoughts. There is no doubt that there are many important elements. So let me go back to the issue of the media and how wise and prudent they should be in non-divide scenarios. That should be an example for all the different systems, because the process of information is really important when it comes to generating perceptions and awareness amongst citizens. That would be of great help. Also, I would like to highlight the issues of inequality, especially from the economic standpoint, which is not precisely inherent in democracy, but it's like a measuring stick. These are important topics, so that we can continue to enhance our electoral models. And I agree with you, Sebastian, in the sense that, yes, in the US, they may be right now questioning whether the system you have today is still viable, or if it should be adapted based on these experiences and considering its relevance for the country. I won't take much of more of your time. Next, we want to listen to Amy Glover. Go ahead, Amy.
Gracias, Claudia.
Thank you, Claudia.
I am going to speak in English.
Voy a hablar en inglés.
Since I'm going to be talking about the U.S. and U.S. institutions. I am a dual citizen, and I've been living in Mexico for the better part of 20 years now. And I really appreciate this invitation. I think it's a fascinating moment in history to be talking about what happened most recently in the US, but the state of democracy globally. And I'm a fan of Amartya Sen, and I think, there has to be more reflection in terms of what is the overall intrinsic value of having a democracy, because I think you hear people being tired of the inefficiencies of democracy, and a questioning of democracy. And I think it's very important to understand that democracy, as Amartya Sen points out, has intrinsic value of freedom and thought of action. And the absence of democracy is in itself an inequality. I think there's often questioning I've heard in Mexico in the context of, is Mexico ready for democracy? Is democracy possible because of some of the complexities of the country? And I would say definitely not. Democracy is part of what we need to consider as development. And then, focusing on the US and what happened most recently, I think, first of all, I'd like to talk about why the US electoral system is so odd and original. And then to reflect a little bit about the history of it and a lot of the social circumstances in the US that I don't think are often appreciated enough, particularly in Mexico or in perhaps globally. The US, because it emerged as the great victor after World War II, I think also has a very nationalistic view and a pride in its system. And there's no doubt the US Constitution is an extremely impressive document, and that when it was written, it was an absolutely revolutionary, innovative document. At the time, there were no other countries that had direct elections where the actual population elected the leader. So there are very hard views of talking about the Constitution as if it was a document that was under certain circumstances. And yes, it was a democratic project, but to be reconsidered. Underestimate the power of nationalism in the US. Influenced from a populist perspective.
Raciales como la xenofobia, pero tenemos que distinguir entre el patriotismo y el nacionalismo, lo cual puede ser peligroso. Y ese concepto de América o los Estados Unidos primero, Estados Unidos es un país grande de nuevo, prácticamente invitaba a regresar a la década de 1950, cuando los Estados Unidos dominaban el mundo y los hombres blancos dominaban la escena social del trabajo y en la nación, y cuando había segregación además. Y quisiera destacar la importancia de la raza en el contexto de los Estados Unidos.
In the country, and many people from an outside perspective have a hard time understanding how important it is. Let's remember, okay, what is one of the oddest issues related to the US electoral system? The Electoral College. Now, the founding fathers decided to opt for the electoral college precisely because, as Sebastian pointed out, they were wary of empowering the masses because they were fearful of precisely the masses being manipulated. But this was created at a time when there was slavery in the South and there was not in the North. In order to create enough political buy-in, they had to make a deal because the southern states, their populations were 40 to 60% slaves. So how were they going to deal with that? In the Constitution, this lofty biblical document, slaves were assigned to be 3/5 of a human being. Okay, let's remember that because it is shocking to think about, but it's a reality. And the way they were able to pass the Constitution was coming to this agreement so that states like Virginia, which had a population 60,
países muy diferentes. Sin embargo, el legado de la esclavitud jamás ha sido abordado en la misma forma en la que los alemanes le hicieron frente al holocausto. La esclavitud fue un holocausto que duró más de 200 años y el sistema electoral, a pesar de lo orgullosos que están los estadounidenses de su democracia, tenía deficiencias terribles para un gran número de personas que vivían en los Estados Unidos. Los derechos electorales de las personas de raza negra en el sur eran violados constantemente. Y hoy en día existe todavía una gran supresión de ciertos votantes. Sin duda alguna, estos temas son temas que necesitan ser abordados y de hecho ya en las últimas 12 décadas hemos tenido 2 elecciones en las que el presidente electo no ganó con el voto popular. De modo que tiene que haber un análisis al respecto. La democracia no es algo que se alcanza así nada más, es algo en lo que se debe trabajar constantemente y la democracia es algo que tiene que modificarse de manera continua. Y yo creo que es difícil esto para los estadounidenses como resultado de las perspectivas o visiones que tienen acerca de sí mismos, porque se consideran superiores a otras personas y no quieren enfrentar el desafío de entrar a la discusión de la reforma. La palabra reforma, de hecho, difícilmente se utiliza en las discusiones sobre temas políticos en los Estados Unidos, porque muchos dicen, bueno, ¿por qué habríamos de reformar? No, es algo que no surge frecuentemente. Y también hay que considerar la naturaleza limitada de lo que es el sistema bipartidista en los Estados Unidos. Seguramente muchos de ustedes han visto o escuchado pláticas acerca del primer ministro de Dinamarca y las negociaciones que están teniendo lugar ahí tan difíciles en el sistema parlamentario. Cuando tienes 2 partidos nada más, creas opciones extremas y es lo que ha sucedido ahí. Y es difícil que en un contexto así permeen existan otros temas.
For example, you see in the Democratic Party, you have the more left-leaning wing with, Bernie Sanders and Alejandra Ocasio-Cortez, and it'll be interesting to see how that is managed moving forward. But certainly, the electoral options in the U.S. are quite limited in that sense. And yet and you realize how much this has to do with culture, how the culture and how history affects the mechanisms and the institutions of the democracy. Because as Sebastian also pointed out, that the changing in the way the primary system has worked. I mean, the primary system is absurd. It lasts for a year. It costs a fortune. It's just not effective. And oftentimes you wind up with the most extreme option. And that's what we saw, with the election of Trump. One thing I think the U.S. democracy does extremely well, and I'd like to share a little bit of my personal experience in terms of being involved with the Democratic Party. I became involved very young working for the Democratic Party. I went to high school in the state of Nevada, and I was one of the few kids at the time who did not support Ronald Reagan, was very, talked a lot about politics. And there was a journalist who came to school and interviewed me. To make a long story short, I became involved in local politics, pushing for the passage of the Martin Luther King holiday in the state of Nevada, which was one of the last states to approve it. In the US, there's a thriving civil society. Everybody's a member of several clubs. everybody, has had an experience where they say, hey, I'm gonna support this candidate. Maybe I'll do some calls. Maybe I'll go to this meeting. Maybe I'll give some money to this candidate because I really like this candidate. I was involved with Democrats Abroad here in Mexico, which was a fascinating exercise. Ana Maria Salazar, got me involved and then dumped me with all the work, right, Ana Maria? But I think that's one thing that's exciting about the US and something that I think I would like to see more of in Mexico, active participation in democracy, because it's not just arriving at the polls, every couple of years. It's deciding what issues are important to me. How can I be involved in my community? And that also makes people much more committed to their democracy because they have a role in it. And another thing that I would like to say in favor of some of the aspects of the US system is that you are a member of the party because you say you are. When you first get your driver's license, pick what is going to be, what party do you support? And you check the box and basically, I'm a Democrat because I say I'm a Democrat. In Spanish, se usa la frase, militas en ese partido, como que militar en un partido. No, it's a totally different concept and feeling to democratic participation. No one gives me permission. I decide, and I decide because I show up. That's it. In terms of, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the modern threats to democracy that were touched on previously, this post-truth environment that we currently find ourselves in, the debilitation of what is often referred to as the fourth estate, which is the press, having a balanced view. The press is extremely important to the democracy because we need to be informed, but we need to be informed based on science, based on data. There are facts. And starting to question facts and saying, well, there are kind of facts, but there are these kind of facts and those kind of facts. And who really knows if, a man went to the moon? Well, yeah, we do know that the earth is round. There is science. And it's extremely important to have fact-based discussions, because if you don't, it's very difficult to have any valuable interchange of ideas. I also, the backlash against globalization could be said in another way. Provincialism. We saw that under Trump. I think we've seen that a bit here in Mexico, closing off to the world. No, I want to do what I want to do. I don't want to hear from other people. And, I'd like to end on kind of a note of, as a human, as Homo sapiens, we have a major problem, which is climate change. It's really not, going back on international coordination is really not even possible at this point. And the most important challenge we face requires global coordination. And let's hope too, that as we face these challenges, we're able as different countries to coordinate effectively in order to make this planet habitable. So I think we face increasing challenges on how to protect democracy and democratic process at a supranational level. And without a doubt, I don't think globalization is to blame for a lot of the inequalities. I think there's been too much discussion of right and left options instead of realizing that one of the basic things that has to happen is investment in health and education, something that has gone terribly awry in the United States. The inequalities in the US have grown considerably over the last 20, 30 years. From when I was a child, the country is a very different place. And then you add the cocktail of multiculturalism, and it's very complex. So I think in order to protect democracy, we need to look at inequalities, both political and economic, and how to how to improve the situation for everyone. And I would just end with a short quote from Amanda Gorman, the poet who spoke very eloquently on Wednesday. While democracy can be periodically delayed, it can never be permanently defeated. So it's something we have to keep working towards. Thank you.
Sin duda, Amy, la democracia se construye momento a momento, día con día, y la recreamos todos y cada una de nosotros. Bueno,
You're
pues,
right, Amy. Democracy is a gradual
es necesario hacer algunas adecuaciones a ese sistema electoral de tu voz como parte
adaptations
de la
and
sociedad,
adjustments
la
to this
integras,
electoral system we have in Mexico, because this is not the first time we have heard suggestions like this. I would like to go back to your point of view in terms of adapting systems to the current context, because the context makes a big difference in all systems and constitutions. As a main line of action, I believe that that's where we can all find the starting point and the point of coincidence. Let's continue with our next speaker, Dr. Jose Luis Valdez. Go ahead, Jose Luis, we're ready to listen to you. Hi, good morning. Thanks to each and all of you for your invitation. Thanks to Lorenzo Cordova, the President Counselor of the INE, and also to Raul Contreras, the Dean of the Law School, which, yes, is the best law school in the country. Congratulations on this initiative. We are participating in today in its third session, which is aimed at shedding some light on the most important aspects of the election process in the U.S. and democratic processes in other parts of the world. I want to commend the rest of the speakers for their interesting insights. The Dean of the Law School asked how the system worked. And Lorenzo Cordova, the President Counselor, said that the U.S. democracy was a fragile democracy, or that it proved fragile, if I understood correctly. Well, I believe it's important to consider these two concepts. They are fundamental, because I am of the idea not only that we have an unheard of U.S. in the early part of the electoral process this year, but it also happened in 2016 when Trump was elected. Well, in this unheard of political, cultural context and electoral context of the U.S. democracy, we also have a democratic crisis. I mean, there is a democratic recession in the U.S., as some people say. And this is combined with the beginning of what I would call a headless state. I mean, the U.S. state suddenly became headless. It didn't have a head. Why? Because who took over? Well, a dysfunctional president, a representative of this popular election via the college. By the way, an institution that must be changed if we're talking about institutions. And he was appointed as the US president in a context of a crisis where Trump himself began to attack the principles of democracy. From there that I believe that democracy in Trump's election is a democratic anomaly. In other words, we have an atypical election in the context of a democratic anomaly because Trump, from the very beginning, made the decision to give power to its enemies, to the enemies of democracy. That is, citizens, civil organizations, political parties, political institutions, the fundamental institutions of the state. Actually, Trump, for 4 years, handled or managed the U.S. state flying by instruments. I mean, the pilot, in other words, was unable to deal with state issues or the most fundamental aspects of the state and its problems. He was flying on instruments because that's where the U.S. Democratic institutionality works very well through its institutions and its executive capacity to achieve governance in such precarious situations like those in the Trump's United States. What are the elements of democracy that Trumpism relied on as a movement that we would have to see if it continues or not, because Trump may subsist or prevail as a political current. Oh, and going back to the college issue, as mentioned by Sebastian and Amy, the Electoral College was designed to prevent dictatorships. The dictatorship of the masses, or the tyranny of the masses, and the tyranny of foreign agents that would be interested in exerting influence on the U.S. to exert their domination after the colonies. In 2016, however, the system failed. The Electoral College didn't operate democratically speaking, not because it wanted to. They did it by design. They allowed a character that was very close to being a tyrant to the political stage, an authoritarian autocrat that developed a cultural current and a way of life that had an impact on all the fundamental arrangements of electoral democracy as we know it in the US. So this populism wave came into the public life of US citizens with an attempt to dismantle institutions, those institutions that led to Trump's victory. I mean, Trumpism used institutions to get to power, but that was, however, the same power that tried to destroy these institutions to perpetuate himself in power after the 2020 elections, even though Joe Biden's election was fully confirmed and there was no proven or probable fraud by the electoral organisms both at the state and federal levels that could explain or prove the existence of a fraud against Trump's interests. This populism and authoritarianism somehow evolved as a result of a bipolar context, a situation of social divide, especially in the area of politics. The main field of action chosen by Trump was that divide, that polarization process, and he did it very efficiently and also in a very well thought manner, because he was able to capture the support of sectors like that of white supremacism, racist neo-Nazi groups, for example, and pseudo-fascist groups and organizations who were the ones that stormed Congress. Of course, not all of them did, but main rioters in this process that stormed the Capitol were people connected to groups like fascist groups. I mean, he was able to capture the imagination of these population sectors that he awoke somehow. Trumpism, to make it very clear, Trumpism promoted or fueled a new way of acting in society that we hadn't seen since the times of the Civil War or since the times of slavery. These, of course, fueled the situation in a dangerous manner. That situation almost caused the U.S. a significant portion of its prestige as a country that has led by example in democracy in the world. There was also rejection of the electoral rules of democracy, which is another important element that I believe we should take into account. Trumpism represents a big democratic anomaly that we cannot overlook. All national and international arrangements or agreements initially subscribed by the U.S. Were considered a problem, and they pulled out of these agreements, which affects the elemental aspects that explain why the U.S. is the oldest and most exemplary democracy possibly in a long time. We also have the divide in a society that doesn't believe in political parties. And also we have this self-proclaimed effort by Trump to play as a president and as a candidate, as well as the use of racism to try to fight dissidents. And we also saw a high level of intolerance, irresponsible intolerance with regard to those actors that saw themselves as part of an active society, who were suggesting deals or agreements to transition to not only a political and democratic achievement. That explains why Trump put the U.S. in a crisis. The divided U.S. of 2016 had already been polarized since the times of Ronald Reagan, when the different centrifugal forces of civil society and political apparatus had reasons to get into a conflict. One of the main issues was that of racial differences. And these tensions revived in this dark and long moment, or maybe short, luckily, because he didn't get elected for a second term. And hopefully this will be his last period. The point is that one of the things they put on the table was the importance of regaining electoral democracy that Trump and his electoral class tried to destroy. It's a paradox. The political establishment, the political elite in the U.S. is the one that defeated both its military institutions.
All of the players were involved except for the Supreme Court of Justice, which decided to not get involved. And they all said that they wanted to make sure that democracy would continue on the whole. And they also wanted to eradicate what was happening, in the sense that there was a political power that was acting against the consolidation of the political system. And all of this was being done through Trumpism, which is why we should ask ourselves if we're talking about the end of an era now, or if we're talking about the revenge being taken by history, which in the long term might lead us to have a centrifugal force within civil society in the US, in which they view Trumpism as a medium and long-term option. I think that this is something that we have to wait and see, to see how political parties organize themselves, particularly the Republican Party. I believe that the Republican Party was pretty much kidnapped by Trumpism. They were aware, the Republicans themselves were aware of what was happening, and they currently, for example, they act as if they hadn't willingly done so, but they were very much aware of what was happening at the time, and they realized the social and the political problems that came about because of that. I think that the Republican Party will depend on on whether Trump continues to be active and if he continues to influence public life during Biden's government and ultimately become an alternative political player in the 2024 elections. I think that though that's very much up in the air. I tend to believe that Trumpism will lose its steam very soon, and that hopefully it will not do away with the ideological content that the country has. But we also have to remember that what was behind Trumpism isn't going to disappear. It's
Yo sé que la discusión sobre el colegio electoral es muy difícil, muy complicada. Discutir el colegio electoral implica irse a los 50 estados de la Unión para discutir en cada uno de los congresos estatales y de las legislaturas estatales hasta dónde el colegio electoral tiene que desaparecer o no, pero en teoría y en la práctica política ya se está discutiendo. Los actores políticos, así como los teóricos del sistema en Estados Unidos, están discutiendo hasta dónde el colegio electoral es o no un instrumento viable, constructivo o no constructivo. Lo fue con Biden, pero lo fue con Biden con muchos esfuerzos, con muchos trabajos. Entonces, el Partido Republicano definirá, y también el Partido Demócrata, y la capacidad que tenga la izquierda del Partido Demócrata de agruparse de una manera constructiva con este centro progresista que representa Biden para evitar que de nuevo el extremismo se presente, el extremismo del partido, del trumpismo, en la forma del trumpismo o en la forma de otra fuerza que venga o que nazca desde el Partido Republicano como una fuerza viva y que pueda aglutinar y congregar de nueva cuenta a estos actores sociales que ciertamente han sido muy perjudiciales para la democracia en su conjunto. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, José Luis Valdés. Pues muy interesantes los temas que nos planteas. Al final del camino, creo que en este último comentario que dices, que corresponde a los partidos acercarse y agruparse constructivamente para atender el tema, creo que radica un punto esencial para ver la fuerza política de este movimiento encabezado por el expresidente Trump. Hemos terminado las participaciones y sus reflexiones, los hemos escuchado. Tengo en nuestro chat unas preguntas que giran en torno a una cuestión que ya hemos estado planteando aquí en las reflexiones, y nos pregunta la audiencia y a todas y a todos quienes participaron, si ustedes consideran que es un momento en el que Estados Unidos se debe de revisar y se debe reformar el sistema electoral, pero también preguntan si es factible ello en las condiciones. He estado escuchando que de alguna u otra forma han presentado sus opiniones con relación a esto, pero me gustaría que en esta intervención centráramos en esta parte nuestras respuestas para atender a nuestra audiencia y poder ver desde su óptica y sus experiencias si es momento y si es viable en este momento. En el orden que participamos, si gustan ustedes, empezamos a participar. Ya te veo, Ana María, por aquí. Adelante, Ana María, por favor.
Obviamente, con los diferentes eventos que se llevaron a cabo, seguramente va a haber un llamado para buscar cómo, no sé si es tanto reformar el sistema del proceso electoral en Estados Unidos, sino cómo reconstruir la credibilidad que necesita el proceso electoral en Estados Unidos. Y eso son tareas muy diferentes, porque en este momento yo creo que con todos los problemas que está enfrentando Estados Unidos en este momento, las prioridades de esta administración forzosamente tiene que ser en tratar de controlar mejor la pandemia, el tema de las vacunas, sobre todo tomar pasos contundentes para poder aliviar la crisis económica que se está viviendo en ese país. Entonces, lo veo difícil que en este momento se pudiera hacer un cambio, por ejemplo, en el colegio electoral, que requeriría no solamente una reforma constitucional, y las reformas constitucionales de Estados Unidos son muy difíciles, pero también tendría que ser avalada y aprobada.
And they would have to be assessed and approved by all of the states. And so I think that the Electoral College will remain at least for another decade. It's hard to imagine that this will change over the next few years. But I do believe that there will be an analysis undertaken of the rules of the game at the local level, which led to the possibility of the election results even being questioned. One of the arguments, for example, presented by the president was that the discretion of election authorities in the states let them change the rules of the game partially to respond to the issue of the pandemic and the problems that were being faced in terms of voter participation. So perhaps letting more people vote prior to the elections and after the elections, and allowing, for example, mail-in voting, or perhaps allowing the votes to come in even after the elections, did open the door to the results being questioned at some point. Because the elections were so close in certain parts, in certain states, for example, that possibly those extra few days would have made a difference between who was a winner and who was a loser. I can't imagine a process in which, based on the experience that we had in 2020, in terms of the use of mail-in voting, is something that should be regulated more clearly, as well as the need to have rules of the game that are very clear for all of the election officials. Because there were some very interesting cases in which perhaps some of the local authorities or local judges might have handled it differently because the elections were so close and there might have been problems in those specific states. So I feel it's going to be extremely important for the states to be involved. There has to be a lot of clarity as to what's going to happen when there are certain contingencies, for example, a pandemic, or if there are social movements taking place or weapons are being used during certain movements. What can be done? How should the authorities handle elections in such a way that they do not influence the vote, but that everybody is clear at the same time of what is going to happen? Because if the U.S. continues along this line, this division, this radicalization of what's happening politically and what the U.S. is and how it should be governed is something that is going to continue. Trumpism hasn't disappeared. I've had the opportunity of interviewing people from the Lincoln Project who were Republicans. They're basically the ones who did very good campaigning against Donald Trump, but they were saying that they're not going to disappear because Trumpism is still alive and kicking. And so I think the best thing that we could do is understand that we need to have very clear rules of the games, and that everything be done in a very public fashion, so that in the next elections, in the next US elections in a few years, because the radicalization will continue, that everybody very clear as to the rules that will be followed in any type of contingency. That will be essential. Thank you, Ana Maria. Sebastian, you have the floor. I'm sorry to limit you all, but we've only got 3 minutes for everybody to respond. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I'll try and be short. Now, in my presentation, I mentioned a very important bill that passed the lower house in 2019 called For the People Act, which includes a whole range of electoral reforms, and it was blocked by the Senate, which was controlled by the Republicans. But now that the Democrats are actually in control of the Senate, they can try and pass that bill, which includes reforms on political finance, gerrymandering, a number of other things. But they need to have, I think, 60 senators. So the Democrats have 50. So they need to convince 10 Republican senators to go along with this. But as I said in my presentation, I think that the Republican Party is facing a real crisis. And if hopefully they'll try and want to reclaim a certain legitimacy in the eyes of the majority, they may go along with this, because I think there's a certain consensus in America that the democratic system, the electoral system, it doesn't work properly. The challenge, of course, is that the system as it stands, from what I understand, benefits Republicans disproportionately. And they're afraid that if it were really reformed, they might lose in future. But at the same time, I think there's such a consensus that there needs to be reform, and the events of the last few weeks hopefully will create a bipartisan consensus, which will allow at least 10 of the Republican senators to join to sign this bill, which can then be passed by the White House. I think it's not impossible. So I think we shouldn't we shouldn't completely dismiss this opportunity. I think there is a sense of crisis in Washington, and I think that this is a kind of moment when things that weren't possible before might become possible, because of the sense of common shared concept, concern and crisis.
Para los gringos, la Constitución es sagrado, ¿no? Y en este momento, con tanta división, sugerir tocar la Constitución se me antoja imposible en el corto plazo. Digo, de que es deseable, de que deberían hacerlo, no cabe duda. Otra cosita que quiero mencionar, porque es importante que el público entienda, otra falla del sistema, que es lo que se llama, es una palabra muy complicada en inglés, gerrymandering. ¿Qué quiere decir? En vez de decir, ok, aquí está el mapa y aquí está el distrito, yo creo mi distrito y pongo todos los blanquitos en un distrito, los hispanos acá, los afroamericanos acá. ¿Qué produce eso? Produce resultados extremos. Si dijéramos, esto es el distrito y va, ¿qué requiere del político? Tú tienes que generar consensos, tú tienes que hablar con afroamericanos, hablar un poco de español con los hispanos, digo, también decir algo a los blancos, ¿no? Como que generar unión en vez de división. Entonces, otra falla garrafal del sistema que tampoco se va a arreglar pronto, lamentablemente.
Muchas gracias, Amy. Doctor José Luis, por favor.
Yo creo que es deseable, pero no es posible la reforma del sistema electoral. No es posible, en parte por lo que ya se dijo, como ya lo dijo Amy, hay muchas resistencias dentro del conjunto de la sociedad civil para modificar sus reglas del juego. Yo digo que un factor fundamental de la reforma del sistema electoral estadounidense sería la desaparición del colegio voto de mayoría. Eso yo no lo veo pasar. Lo que en todo caso creería que podría ser posible, y esto me lleva a la pregunta de cómo reconstruir la convivencia democrática y la tolerancia en la sociedad norteamericana que nos planteó, creo que Roberto, es más bien el regreso a una civilidad democrática. Una civilidad democrática en donde, como dice Amy, se cuenten todos los votos y todos los derechos políticos de los ciudadanos estadounidenses, es decir, de los blancos, de los afroestadounidenses, de los latinos, de los asiáticos. La manipulación electoral que ha llevado en buena medida a cabo el Partido Republicano, tanto en la legislación federal como en sus legislaciones estatales, ha sido responsable de redistritar los distritos aquellos en los cuales el Partido Republicano podría correr con la mala suerte de no tener la mayoría. Se ha manipulado la participación electoral de la gente. Esto sí podría de alguna manera permitirnos vivir un escenario de regreso a la civilidad democrática que se perdió. Yo creo que eso es clave. Una civilidad democrática que nos permita poder, por parte de los actores políticos, contar con actores racionales, responsables, que impulsen y no detengan el avance democrático de los Estados Unidos. Ahora, ¿qué pasará con el trumpismo? Bueno, como ya lo dijimos, el trumpismo llegó para quedarse. Yo pienso que en el corto plazo sí. Yo no estoy tan seguro de que el trumpismo vaya a ser una corriente de acción política de larguísimo plazo en los Estados Unidos. Lo que sí tenemos en este momento como un pendiente fundamental, por lo menos para Biden, es reconstruir el consenso social, reconstruir el consenso político en los Estados Unidos, tejer, digamos, curar las heridas que dejó el trumpismo y que dejó esta coyuntura tan crítica que los Estados Unidos vivieron. Y en esa medida me parece que la responsabilidad, junto con lo de la pandemia, la recuperación económica,
in addition
todos los
to economic recovery and dealing with the pandemic will be very important, and they will be focusing more on that perhaps than on election reforms. Perhaps at some point they'll be having somebody like our Lorenzo Cordova going to Washington, D.C. to represent Mexico and explain what they could create, such as our INE, how they could create their own INE, but I don't think that's going to be happening soon. But I think it would be at least important for the rules of the game to be very clear. Lastly, Claudia, I would just say that the U.S. behaved very well. They voted in a timely fashion. They stood in line. I don't know if I would have stood in line for that long. And President Biden won by a clear majority with very high numbers. One of the biggest one of the highest voter participation in the history of the U.S. So I think that we have to be able to respond to those citizens, give them what they want, give them a political system and a social and political climate that will enable everybody to have a sense of justice and ensure that they have more democracy in the U.S. than they have had most recently. Thank you very much. Sorry for taking up too much more time than I was allotted. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to give the floor to the President of the Council to close the event. There are a few questions that were left pending, and that has to do with the fact that in the election system, the jurisdictional system that they have in the U.S., judges tend to always be faithful to the Constitution and not to any political party, which is always very useful. I'd like to give the last few minutes to the President of the Council. But before I do that, I would like to thank all of the organizers of this event, Maria del Carmen Alanís, Fernando Gesto, Manuel Carrillo, thank you very much. Crilce as well for her backing and assistance. Thank you to all, and thank you all for your I'd like to thank all of the panelists as well, and I would like to conclude as the moderator by saying thank you for including me, allowing me to be here with you, and I would just like to remind you of a few of the words of Poet Laureate Gorman yesterday, who said, "We trust what is happening now because we have to look towards the future. History is watching us." Thank you very much. I hand the floor to Mr. Córdoba Villanello. Thank you very much. I would also like to thank you for moderating this event. I'm not going to take any more of your time up. I would just like to make a few final comments. The first one, with regard to this last round, in which the panelists spoke about election reforms. I think that political theory and our experience makes the suggestion that the rules of the game be very clear. A discussion, a consensus regarding the rules of the game has to be as broad and as inclusive as possible, because otherwise we will have problems. If the rules of the game only satisfy a certain part of the community, they can ultimately say afterwards that they lost because the rules of the game were biased. And I think that's something that we have to remember in Mexico as well as in the US. And a consensus, a broad consensus has to be reached. A second comment I would make is that I think that what has happened and what I see is underlying everything is that all democracies, some of which may be stronger or older than others, we're all facing common problems. Sebastian would probably agree with me in the sense that they've learned a lot in the Kofi Annan Foundation as to what's been happening. But democracies in general, I would say, have been going through some changes and tough times, and we're paying because of the fact that democracy made a lot of promises and hasn't been able to fulfill them all. There are problems with poverty, crime rates, and that ultimately will come back and require us to give comments as to why democracy hasn't been able to deal with all of the problems of society. And my final comment is that we also have to remember that it's true that the US has had a lot of problems, but all democracies are facing problems. And in that sense, I would like to thank the School of Law for organizing this event and the need to talk about this subject. And I would like to thank everybody for participating in the event. And so, as I was saying, it's important for us to think about our democracies and how elections are held, and try to understand how we can use all of the experiences from other countries to have better our elections in our own countries. Thank you very much, everybody. And with that, I would like to conclude my remarks and hand the mic back to you. Thank you. All right, Lorenzo. Well, as you heard, this has been a very enriching conversation, highly motivating. It's been a true pleasure to listen to Ana Maria Salazar, Jose Luis Valdez, Amy Glover, and Sebastian Brock. And I think that we can conclude this cycle by reaching some very interesting conclusions. First of all, I would like to take advantage of this opportunity to say that the attack on Capitol Hill is something that everybody is going to continue to be discussing over the next few weeks. Everybody's aware that the polarization that had been taking place ever since President Obama reached the presidency was going to continue anyhow. And if we don't deal with what has happened recently, things are going to get worse in the future. I think that we're all aware
Partido Republicano, y creo que la necesidad de una reforma electoral en Estados Unidos pues no es una sugerencia académica, es una realidad política. Ojalá lo sepan aprovechar, y creo que se cumple con el otro objetivo, que es México ha padecido muchas cosas México ha batallado mucho, ha invertido mucho, ha logrado muchos consensos y creo que hoy por hoy el sistema electoral mexicano es un sistema ejemplar incluso para los Estados Unidos. Y creo que esto vale la pena porque muchas veces estamos acostumbrados a siempre ser muy críticos, a siempre encontrarle defectos a las cosas, a que cada que haya una elección se haga una reforma para ver si los que perdieron a la que sigue sí pueden ganar. Y creo que de alguna manera hoy podemos sentirnos tranquilos, podemos sentirnos satisfechos de que tenemos un sistema electoral que no tengo ninguna duda habrá de resistir el reto que la propia pandemia nos está dando. Creo que hoy el reto no va a ser cómo está la estructura electoral, sino cómo la vamos a hacer funcionar en tiempos de pandemia, pero creo que México tiene hoy un sistema electoral que puede ser ejemplar y que incluso deberá ser copiado por otras naciones y por Estados Unidos, que no es la excepción. Muchas gracias a todos los panelistas por haber acudido a esta reunión académica. Estoy seguro que las conclusiones que habremos de sacar de estas reuniones serán, es un conocimiento que se está generando, que habremos de poner a la difusión y al servicio de la sociedad, no solamente de México, sino internacional. Cuídense mucho y muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Sebastian. Thank you so much. I embrace you very humbly. Y Ana María, Amy creo que ya salió, pero Ana María, mil gracias. Nos vemos pronto, sin falta. El maestro no, ahí es José Luis, ahí estás, ya te abrazo también con mucho afecto. Muchísimas gracias, José Luis, de verdad. Y bueno, a Mari Carmen y Fernando, gracias de nueva cuenta. Y al equipo técnico.
Muchísimas gracias,
Claudia.
A todos. Qué gusto, presidente. José Luis, Ana María, Maca, Fernando, qué gusto verles, encontrarles. Gracias, Manuel.